What if everything you've been told about success is only half the story? Behind every legend is a journey no one talks about. The failures, the sacrifices, the moments that almost broke them. From innovators to world changers to minds that shaped history, we break down what truly made them great. Because greatness isn't luck. This is Greatness Explained TV, where greatness is broken down. Subscribe and start thinking like the greats.
The puddles around the camp had frozen overnight. The wind came in off the Atlantic at 27 miles an hour, biting through coat and skin and bone, and the thin man lying flat on the lower wing of the strange machine could feel the cold crawling up through the wooden frame beneath his chest. Below him the motor was running. It coughed and roared and shook the whole contraption like a living thing trying to tear itself loose from the rail. His brother stood at the wingtip, one hand pressed against the cloth, ready to run. Around them, 4 men from the life-saving station and a boy from Nag's Head stood watching with their hands jammed in their pockets, half frozen, half certain they were about to witness something foolish. One of them had been told to squeeze a rubber bulb on a camera the instant the machine left the rail, if it ever did. The man on the wing reached forward and slipped the wire that held the machine to the track. For a moment nothing happened. The wind held it. The motor screamed. And then, slowly, agonizingly, impossibly slowly, the machine began to crawl forward into the gale. His brother ran alongside, one hand on the wing, his feet pounding the cold sand. 40 feet. The skids lifted. The wheels left the rail. And the man lying on the lower wing felt the ground drop away beneath him. He was flying. It lasted 12 seconds. 12 seconds and a little over 100 feet of pitching, darting, terrified motion before the machine came down hard against the sand. 12 seconds that most of the men standing there would not have believed had they not seen it with their own eyes, and that the rest of the world would refuse to believe for nearly 5 more years. But in those 12 seconds, on a freezing beach in North Carolina, on the 17th of December in the year 1903, a machine carrying a man had lifted itself into the air by its own power, flown forward without losing speed, and landed at a point as high as the one from which it rose. For the first time in the entire history of the human race, it had been done. And almost nobody was watching. Now stop for a moment, because this is the part that matters to you. You have flown. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but somewhere in your life you have sat in a metal tube 6 miles above the surface of the earth, eating a small meal off a plastic tray, mildly annoyed that the person in front of you reclined their seat. You have watched the clouds from above. You have crossed an ocean in the time it takes to watch 2 films. You have done a thing that every king, every emperor, every prophet and poet and philosopher who ever lived before the 20th century would have considered an impossibility on the same level as raising the dead. And you did it without a second thought. That gift, that ordinary, casual, world-shrinking miracle, was handed to you by 2 brothers who never finished college, who had no fortune, no government behind them, no scientific establishment that believed in them, and who paid for the entire dream out of the profits of a small bicycle repair shop on a quiet street in Dayton, Ohio. The question this story is going to ask you is not how they did it. The mechanics are interesting, but they are not the point. The question is this: what does it take in a human being to keep working, quietly, methodically, for years, on something the entire world has already decided is impossible? What does it cost? And do you have it in you? By the end of this story, you are going to understand something about persistence that very few people ever learn. You are going to see 2 ordinary men do an extraordinary thing, and then you are going to see what it did to them. And there is a turn near the end of this story, a quiet, devastating turn, that I promise will stay with you long after you have closed this video. So before we go any further, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now. Tap that button. Because the stories we tell here are the stories of the men and women who changed the world and were forgotten, or doubted, or mocked while they did it, and you are going to want to be here for the next one. Now let us go back. Back before the beach. Back before the machine. Back to a world that had never once, in all its long history, seen a man leave the ground. To understand how strange this all was, you have to understand the world they were born into. In the 1860s and 70s, when Wilbur and Orville Wright were children, the fastest thing most human beings would ever experience was a galloping horse or a steam train. There were no automobiles on the roads. There was no radio in the homes. Electric light was a curiosity, not a fixture. A letter took days to cross the country, and the idea that a human being might leave the surface of the earth in a heavier-than-air machine was not merely doubted, it was a punchline. It was the kind of thing humorists wrote jokes about. It belonged in the same category as perpetual motion and turning lead into gold. Serious men did not waste their time on it. The respectable scientific opinion of the age held, quite firmly, that human flight was either impossible or so far off as to be meaningless. Into this world came a family that was, in almost every outward way, unremarkable. Their father was Milton Wright, a bishop of the United Brethren Church, a serious, principled, stubborn man born in a log cabin in Indiana, who had grown up among pioneer stock and carried their flinty independence in his bones. He was a man of conviction, sometimes to the point of conflict, and he ran a household built on books, argument, and the freedom to think. Their mother was Susan Kerner Wright, the daughter of a carriage maker, and she was the secret engine of the family's genius, though almost no one outside the home ever knew it. Susan was clever with her hands in a way that astonished everyone around her. She designed and sewed her own clothing. She adapted household tools to uses they were never meant for. She once built a sled for her 2 older boys with her own hands. As the family liked to say of her, she could mend anything. It is no small thing that the mother of the men who invented the airplane was herself a natural mechanic and an inventor of small domestic miracles. The boys did not inherit their gift from nowhere. They watched her solve problems with whatever was at hand, and they learned, long before they could have said so, that the physical world was a thing that could be understood, taken apart, and bent to a clear and patient will. The family moved often, as a minister's family does, Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, and back again. But it was in Dayton, Ohio, on a modest street called Hawthorne, that the Wright children grew into the people they would become. There were older brothers and a beloved younger sister, Catherine, who would one day become a fierce and brilliant defender of her brother's legacy. But the two at the center of this story were the 2 middle sons. Wilbur, the elder, sharp-minded and intense, a great reader and a natural athlete, and Orville, the younger, restless, inventive, always building something, always running some small scheme or enterprise. They were not rich. They were not poor. They were the children of a serious household in the great expanding middle of 19th century America, surrounded by books and ideas and the quiet expectation that a person ought to use his mind. There was, on the surface of it, nothing in any of this to suggest that 2 of these children would one day stand the entire course of human history on its head. But there was one small object, one toy, and it changed everything. One day, Bishop Wright came home from a trip on church business, and he had brought a present for his 2 younger boys. "Look here, boys," he said, and he held out his hands with something hidden between them. Then he tossed it toward them. The boys reached for it, expecting it to fall into their hands or drop to the floor. But it did neither. Instead, the little object rose. It climbed toward the ceiling of the room, hung there for a moment, fluttering, and only then drifted slowly down. It was a toy, a small helicopter of cork, bamboo, and thin paper, powered by nothing but a twisted rubber band, invented by a Frenchman named Alphonse Pinard. It weighed almost nothing. And it flew. The boys called it the Bat. They were enchanted by it. They played with it until, like all fragile toys, it fell apart. But the impression it left on their minds never faded. There was something in that small fluttering thing that lodged itself deep in Wilbur and Orville and would not let go. And here is the first clue to who these brothers were. A normal child plays with the toy until it breaks and then forgets it. Wilbur did not forget it. He decided to build a bigger one. If a small machine could fly, then surely a larger one could fly higher and longer. So he built one. And then a larger one. And then a larger one still. And to his complete bewilderment, the bigger he made them, the worse they flew, until the largest would not leave the ground at all. He did not yet understand the brutal mathematics of it, that doubling the size of a flying thing demands 8 times the power to lift it. But notice what is already there in that little boy, hunched over his failing models, refusing to accept the obvious lesson that flight was a thing for toys and not for men. He had been handed a mystery, and instead of being satisfied by the magic of it, He was infuriated by what he did not understand. That hunger, that refusal to let a question go, was the spark. It would smolder quietly for years, but it would never go out. And then, before the brothers were grown, the world cracked open beneath them. Wilbur was the bright one. He was meant for university, for Yale, the family thought, and from there for a profession, a respectable life of the mind. He was an extraordinary athlete, a graceful skater, the finest gymnast on the horizontal bar in all of Dayton. He had a quick, deep, capacious intelligence and a future that seemed to stretch out clean and bright before him. And then, one winter, in a game of shinny, a rough game played with sticks and a ball, out on the ice, on skates, a club came up out of the scrum and caught Wilbur full in the face. The blow knocked out all of his upper front teeth. That alone would have been a catastrophe for a proud young man on the edge of adulthood. But it was the beginning, not the end. In the aftermath of the injury, Wilbur's health collapsed. He developed a disorder of the heart that lingered, that would not lift, that turned the brilliant athletic young man into an invalid. The plans for Yale evaporated. The bright, clean future folded in on itself. And Wilbur, who should have been away at university beginning a life, instead retreated into the house on Hawthorne Street, into the upstairs rooms, into a kind of long gray exile from the world. For years he barely went out. He could not run, could not race, could not return to the athletic life that had been his joy. He turned inward, and he turned to the one thing that was still wholly his: books. He read through his father's serious library, the heavy theology and history, and the family's shelves downstairs, Plutarch's Lives of the Great Men of Antiquity, Gibbon's vast account of the fall of Rome, the histories of England and France, the essays, the encyclopedias. He read the way a starving man eats. In those silent years, a young man whose body had failed him built an extraordinary mind. And in the middle of those gray years, the worst thing of all happened. His mother, Susan, the clever, gentle, inventive woman at the heart of the family, fell mortally ill. And it was Wilbur, the invalid son, too sick himself for the active world, who stayed home and nursed her. For the last years of her life he was almost constantly at her side, the two of them shut away together, the dying mother and the broken son. On the 4th of July, 1889, Susan Kerner Wright died. Take the measure of this. Before he had even properly begun his life, Wilbur Wright had lost his health, lost his future, lost his place in the world, and lost the person he was caring for with his own hands. Anyone watching would have written him off, a promising young man whom life had quietly destroyed before he ever got started. He was, by any reasonable account of the matter, finished. And here is one of the great mysteries of this story, and of every story like it: the wound did not kill the thing inside him. It concentrated it. The years of forced stillness, the deep reading, the patience learned at a sickbed, the refusal to be defined by what had broken, all of it was, though no one could have known it, the precise and exact training a man would need to spend a decade methodically solving the hardest physical problem in human history. The injury that should have ended Wilbur Wright was, in a sense the universe rarely makes so plain, the making of him. He recovered, slowly. And when the brothers were ready to make their way in the world, they did it together, and they did it, of all things, in print and in bicycles. It began with a printing press. Orville, the younger brother, had caught the printing bug as a boy, building presses out of scrap and trading away a treasured boat to get the parts for a better one. By the time the brothers were young men, they were running a real printing business together, turning out a neighborhood newspaper, the West Side News, and later a daily, and even a paper for the black community of Dayton. They were good at it, careful, inventive, willing to build their own equipment when what they needed did not exist. Already the pattern of their lives was set: see a problem, study it, and if the tool to solve it cannot be bought, build the tool. Then came the bicycle. In the early 1890s, the bicycle was sweeping America like a fever. The new, safety bicycle, with its 2 equal wheels and its pneumatic tires, had made cycling possible for ordinary people, and the whole country went mad for it. The brothers bought bicycles. Orville started racing. And in December of 1892, with the instinct of born mechanics and businessmen, they opened a shop to sell and repair them. Soon they were not merely repairing bicycles but building their own, the Wright Cycle Company, machines made by hand with care, in the back of their shop. This is the unglamorous truth at the heart of the legend. The men who conquered the sky were small-town tradesmen. They balanced wheels and patched tires and sold bicycles to the people of Dayton. They had grease under their fingernails. They worked with their hands every day, and in doing so they were building, without knowing it, the exact set of skills that the conquest of the air would require: an intimate, physical understanding of balance, of structure, of how a machine and a human body work together in motion. A bicycle, after all, is a machine that should fall over and does not. A machine kept upright by the constant, subtle, active control of the rider. No one in the world understood the marriage of balance and control better than two men who built bicycles for a living. And then, in the mid-1890s, the brothers read of a man's death. His name was Otto Lilienthal, a German engineer who had become famous across the world for his daring experiments in flight. Lilienthal built gliders, beautiful, fragile, bird-like wings, and he flew them himself, leaping from hills, soaring for hundreds of feet, photographed hanging beneath his wings in the open air. He was the first man to fly in any real and repeatable way, and the brothers admired him enormously. Lilienthal became their hero. In 1896, Otto Lilienthal's glider stalled in midair, and he fell, and he broke his back, and he died. His last words, reported around the world, were that sacrifices must be made. The death of their hero did not frighten the Wrights away from flight. It drew them toward it. If a man as brilliant and brave as Lilienthal had died, it was not because flight was impossible, Lilienthal had proved it was not, but because the problem of control had not yet been solved. The wings could be built. The lift could be had. But no one yet knew how to balance a flying machine in the moving, treacherous air, how to keep it from tipping and stalling and falling. That was the problem. And it was precisely the kind of problem that two bicycle builders, who thought about balance and control every single day of their working lives, were uniquely prepared to attack. So they began. What followed was years of work of a kind that almost no one has the patience to do. The brothers read everything they could find. They wrote to the Smithsonian Institution for every scrap of published material on flight. And the more they read, the more they realized that much of the accepted wisdom, the published tables of air pressure that everyone relied upon, the figures handed down by respected experts, was simply wrong. The numbers did not work. The data that the entire field rested upon was riddled with error. A lesser pair of men would have trusted the experts and failed. The Wrights did something almost unheard of. They threw the experts out and decided to gather the data themselves from scratch. They built a wind tunnel, a homemade box in the back of the bicycle shop, with a fan to drive air through it, and inside it they tested hundreds of tiny model wings of every conceivable shape and curve, measuring with painstaking care exactly how each one behaved in moving air. Night after night, in the lamplight of a bicycle shop in Ohio, two men with no formal training in engineering compiled the most accurate tables of aerodynamic data that had ever existed in the history of the world. Everything that came after rested on that quiet, unglamorous, obsessive labor. And they made their great breakthrough, the one nobody else had, by watching birds and, the story goes, by idly twisting an empty bicycle inner tube box in the shop one day. They noticed that a long, thin box could be twisted so that one end angled up while the other angled down. What if a wing could do that? What if, instead of being rigid, the wings of a flying machine could be gently warped, one side twisted up, the other down, so that the machine could roll and bank and balance itself in the air, the way a bird subtly adjusts the tips of its wings? This was the missing key. This was the answer to the problem that had killed Lilienthal. They called it wing warping, and it was, in its essence, the principle of control that every aircraft on Earth still uses to this day. But theory was not enough. They had to test it on real machines, in real wind, with their own bodies on the line. And for that they needed a place with steady, strong, reliable wind and soft sand to fall on. After writing to the Weather Bureau, they found their place, a remote, wind-scoured spit of sand on the coast of North Carolina, a tiny, hard-to-reach hamlet called Kitty Hawk. So began the pilgrimages. Year after year, the brothers left the bicycle shop in the care of their family and traveled hundreds of miles to the desolate dunes of Kitty Hawk, to mosquitoes and storms and primitive camps, to backbreaking labor hauling their machines across the sand. In 1900 they flew their first glider, mostly as a kite. In 1901 they came back with a larger one, and were so frustrated by its poor performance, so betrayed by the faulty published data, that on the train home a discouraged Wilbur was said to have declared that man would not fly in 1,000 years. But they did not stop. That winter, in the wind tunnel, they found the truth, and they corrected it. In 1902 they returned to Kitty Hawk with a new glider built on their own data, and this time it worked. They added a movable rudder in the back, linked it to the wing warping, and suddenly they had a machine they could truly control. Turn it, bank it, hold it steady in the gusting air. They made hundreds of glides. They had solved the problem of control that no one else on Earth had solved. Now only one thing remained. They needed power. They needed an engine light enough and strong enough to drive a machine through the air, and propellers to push it. So they wrote to every automobile and engine manufacturer in the country asking for a motor that could do the job. Not one of them could supply it. So the brothers built their own. And they discovered, in the building, that no one understood how a propeller should be shaped to work in air rather than water, so they had to invent the entire theory of the aerial propeller from first principles, arguing with each other late into the night, each man working it out until they both understood a thing that no human being had ever properly understood before. By the autumn of 1903, they had it. A machine of wood and cloth and wire, weighing some 750 pounds, with their own homemade engine and their own theoretically perfect propellers, sitting in a shed on the sand at Kitty Hawk, waiting for a wind. Which brings us back to that freezing morning in December, to the iced puddles and the screaming motor and the man lying flat on the lower wing. On the 14th of December, they tried first and failed. Wilbur, winning the toss, took it up too steeply, stalled, and came down hard in the sand, breaking a part of the machine. 2 days of repairs. Then, on the morning of the 17th, in that bitter 27-mile wind, with the puddles frozen and the 5 witnesses shivering, it was Orville's turn. 12 seconds. 120 feet. The first flight in the history of the world. But they were not finished. They hauled the machine back, warmed their frozen hands by the stove, and went up again. Wilbur flew the second. Orville the third. And then, just past noon, Wilbur took it up for the 4th flight of the day. And this time the machine, after the first wild pitching, settled into something steadier. It flew on. 300 feet. 500. 800. For 59 seconds it flew, covering 852 feet of ground, until at last it pitched down and struck the sand. 59 seconds of sustained, controlled, powered human flight. The age of the air had begun. And then, as the brothers and the lifesavers stood about discussing it, a sudden gust caught the machine and flipped it over and over across the sand, tumbling one of the men inside it, smashing the engine and the wings, ending all flying for that season. It did not matter. The thing was done. They sent a telegram home. They had flown, for flights, the longest 59 seconds, and would be home for Christmas. They asked their father to inform the press. And here we come to the strangest, hardest, most human chapter of the entire story. Because the brothers had done the impossible, and the world refused to believe them. You would think that the invention of flight would have been front-page news around the globe within hours. It was not. The local Dayton newspaper editor who had once turned down the story dismissed it. Reporters could not be bothered. The telegram announcing the first flight in human history was met with shrugs and disbelief and, in one editorial office, the question of why they should print such nonsense at all. The few garbled reports that did appear got the facts wrong and made the brothers sound like cranks. And so the Wrights did something that, in hindsight, seems almost unbelievable. They went home and they kept working, and they kept flying, in near total obscurity, for years. They could not return to remote Kitty Hawk for all their experiments, so they found a cow pasture outside Dayton, a flat field belonging to a man named Huffman, and there, within sight of a passing trolley line, they taught themselves to truly fly. They built better machines. In 1904, they flew the first complete circle ever flown by a powered aircraft. They flew for minutes at a time, around and around the field, in plain view of anyone who cared to look. And almost no one cared to look. The story of these years is almost comic in its blindness, and it would be funny if it were not so revealing of human nature. A local newspaperman, riding the trolley with Orville, heard that the brothers had been flying around the field and thought it might make a small item. He asked Orville if it was true. "Oh yes," Orville admitted. "They often did that." And then he changed the subject. The reporter decided it could not be important after all. The inventor himself did not seem to think it was a big deal, so why should anyone else? It was not, he concluded, worth a line in the paper. Another day the same reporter asked if the brothers had done anything interesting lately. "Oh, nothing much," said Orville. "Today one of us flew for nearly 5 minutes." "Where did you go?" "Around the field." "Oh, just around the field. I see. Well, we'll keep in touch with you." Read that again, and let the strangeness of it sink all the way in. Two men had achieved the oldest dream of the human species, the dream of Icarus, the dream of every child who ever watched a bird and ached, and they were flying it in circles over an Ohio pasture, and the world could not be troubled to walk across a field and watch. The humor magazines printed jokes about the absurd idea of flying men. The respectable experts went on insisting it was decades away. The neighbors thought the brothers were a pair of harmless eccentrics. There was an old argument heard around those parts, that if God had intended man to fly, he would have given him wings. This is the darkest hour of the story, and I want you to feel it for what it is. It is not the failure that breaks most people. The Wrights had already conquered failure, over and over, in the wind tunnel and on the sand. It is something harder than failure. It is the silence. It is doing the most important work of your life, doing it correctly, succeeding at it completely, and being met by a world that yawns and looks away. Many a person could survive years of failure who could not survive a single year of being right and being ignored. The temptation in that silence is overwhelming. To grow bitter, to grow loud, to grab the world by the collar and demand recognition, or else to simply give up and conclude that if no one cares, perhaps it was never worth doing. The Wrights did neither. They did not shout and they did not quit. They simply went on working, refining, improving year after patient year, certain of what they had done, secure in their own carefully gathered data, indifferent to the verdict of a world that had not yet caught up to them. They guarded their invention. They sought patents. They negotiated quietly with governments. And they waited. And then, in 1908, after years of obscurity, Wilbur Wright took a machine across the ocean to France. The French had heard the reports and largely dismissed them as American bluff. The Wrights, they said, were probably bluffers. Some flatly claimed there was no real evidence the men had ever flown at all. Wilbur arrived in France a doubted, half-mocked figure, assembling his machine in a shed at a racetrack near the town of Le Mans, taking no chances, fussing over every detail while the skeptical French press waited to see the American embarrassed. On the day Wilbur Wright finally took to the air over France, the doubt did not fade slowly. It vanished in an instant. He did not merely fly. He turned. He carved graceful, perfect, controlled circles in the European sky, figure eights, sweeping curves, the machine answering his every touch, doing things no European aviator had come close to doing, with a mastery that made every flying experiment Europe had managed look like a clumsy hop. The crowd went out of its minds. The skeptics were thunderstruck. Overnight, the doubted American bluffer became the most celebrated man in France. Souvenir postcards bearing his image flooded the country. Crowds of thousands came from all over Europe, kings among them, to watch the quiet bicycle mechanic from Ohio fly. The French ambassador would later declare that Wilbur Wright was simply the biggest man in France. And what won the people was not only the flying, but the man himself. His modesty, his decency, his plain, unaffected manner, his refusal to be changed in the slightest by the adoration of a continent. The silence was over. After years in the wilderness, the Wright brothers were, at last, what they had been all along, world heroes. The vindication was total. But this story does not end in triumph. And the turn it takes now is the thing I promised you would not forget. The years that followed should have been the brothers' reward. They were famous now, honored everywhere, their priority established, their genius beyond dispute. They built a great house in Dayton. They started a company. They trained pilots, among them young men who would go on to lead the air forces of a world war. But fame brought a poison with it. As the world finally understood what the Wrights had made, every imitator and rival raced to copy it, and a long, bitter, exhausting war of patents began. The brothers had given the world flight. Now they had to fight, in courtroom after courtroom, across America and France and Germany, to defend the rights to the thing they had built with their own hands out of nothing. It was draining, ugly, endless work, utterly unlike the clean, joyful problem-solving of the bicycle shop and the windswept sand. The men who had once spent their nights happily arguing about the shape of a propeller now spent them buried in legal papers, worn down by litigation, defending themselves against people who had contributed nothing and wanted everything. And it was Wilbur, the elder brother, the great reader, the boy whose teeth had been knocked out on the ice, the invalid who had nursed his dying mother and built a magnificent mind in the gray years of his exile, the man who had stood over the French and made them weep with wonder. It was Wilbur upon whom this burden fell heaviest. He carried the worry of the patent wars. He traveled. He fought. He did not rest. In the spring of 1912, just after visiting the site of the family's grand new home, Wilbur fell ill. At first it seemed minor. It was not. It was typhoid fever, and a man worn thin by years of worry and litigation had nothing left to fight it with. For 3 weeks he lay dying, despite the best doctors that could be found. And early on the morning of the 30th of May, 1912, Wilbur Wright died. He was 45 years old. 45 years and 44 days. Messages of grief poured in from 2 hemispheres, from the heads of governments, from a world that had finally, fully understood what it had lost. But it was too late to give Wilbur Wright his years back. The man who had given humanity the sky was gone before he reached 50, worn out not by the conquest of the air but by the small, grinding, all-too-human fight over who would profit from it. Think about that. The hardest battles of his life were not against the wind, or the false data, or the unsolved riddle of flight. He won all of those. The thing that finally broke him was the bitterness of other men. The lawsuits, the imitators, the squabbling over credit and money that always seems to descend upon the people who actually make something new. He flew over the heads of the kings of Europe. And he died fighting in courtrooms. This is the part one asked you to sit with. The triumph and the cost are not separate things in this story. They are the same thing. The very achievement that made the Wright brothers immortal also consumed one of them. Greatness is not free. It is never free. And now look up. Look up the next time you are in an airport, watching the great machines climb into the clouds, hundreds of them every hour, all over the world, carrying millions of human beings across oceans and continents as casually as their ancestors once crossed a street. Every single one of them, the largest jet, the smallest plane, is the direct descendant of that fragile machine of wood and cloth and wire on the sand at Kitty Hawk. Every one of them banks and turns by the same principle of control that 2 bicycle mechanics worked out by twisting an empty cardboard box in a shop in Ohio. The entire modern world, global trade, the family scattered across continents and reunited in a day, the relief flight to the disaster zone, the very shape of the century that followed, all of it flows from those 12 seconds on a freezing beach. You are living, right now, inside the world that Wilbur and Orville Wright imagined when no one else would. When you board a plane, you are stepping into their dream. When you watch a contrail cut across the sky, you are reading their signature on the heavens. They did not just build a machine. They redrew the map of what a human being is allowed to want. And they did it without money, without status, without permission, and without applause, for years and years, in a silence that would have crushed almost anyone else. So here, at the end, is the question this story has been carrying toward you the whole time. The Wright brothers were not the smartest men of their age. There were professors and famous experts who were better trained, better funded, better connected, and who all failed where 2 bicycle mechanics succeeded. They were not the bravest, the richest, or the luckiest. What they had was something rarer and quieter than any of those things. They had the capacity to keep working, methodically and patiently, on something they believed was true, in the face of a world that laughed at them, ignored them, and refused for years to even look up from its newspaper. They trusted their own carefully gathered data over the loud opinions of experts. They threw out the accepted wisdom when the accepted wisdom was wrong. They did the unglamorous work, the hundreds of tiny wing models, the freezing camps, the broken parts repaired and tried again, long after the excitement had worn off and no one was clapping. And when the world was still not watching, they kept flying anyway. So ask yourself, honestly, what is the thing you have been told is impossible? What is the dream you have quietly set down because the experts said it couldn't be done, or because no one was watching, or because the silence got too loud? What would you build in the back of your own shop if you stopped waiting for the world's permission and simply began? Because the lesson of these two brothers is not really about airplanes. It is this: the world will not believe you until it has no choice. The world will look away from your best and most important work, sometimes for years. And the only thing that determines whether you join the small company of people who actually change something is whether you can keep going in that silence, doing the work correctly, trusting what you know to be true, long after everyone has stopped paying attention. Wilbur Wright died at 45, worn out, fighting over the very gift he had given the world. He never got to grow old in the sky he opened. But every time you leave the ground, you finish his flight for him. So what is your Kitty Hawk? And how long are you willing to keep working before the world finally looks up? Sit with that one. If this story moved you, stirred something in you, or made you see the sky a little differently, do something with it. Give this video a like, because it genuinely helps more people find these stories. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who has set down a dream too soon, or who has been working in silence and wondering if it matters. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are more lives like this one waiting to be told, more men and women who changed the world and were doubted while they did it. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country or your city below. It always amazes me to see how far these stories travel, from one quiet corner of the world to another. Two brothers from a small street in Dayton, Ohio shrank the whole planet so that we could all be a little closer. The least we can do is wave to each other across it. Until the next story, keep building even when no one is watching.